In this year's Norway chess tournament, we had an epic blitz match between two chess titans, Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. Carlsen, the former world chess champion, faces Hikaru, a brilliant tactician. Now let's dive into this electrifying blitz match at Norway chess between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. Hikaru starts the game with the white pieces by playing d4, and Magnus responds with d5. But at this point, Magnus is almost down half a minute on the clock. Fun fact, that's because Magnus was late for the match. Hikaru, being a good sportsman, only played the first move when an official told him to do so. After d4, Magnus replies with d5. Then after normal development, nf3 and nf6, Hikaru played bishop g5. Regarding Hikaru's preparation, it was the classical Trompowsky order, which he explained in one of his Twitch streams, where the bishop puts pressure on the knight on f6 after d4, focusing on d and e pawn. But since Magnus went for d5 after d4, Hikaru had to counter-develop his knight on f3 to have an equal or competitive control towards the center. Magnus goes ne4. Hikaru protects his bishop with bf4, and Magnus goes c5. Hikaru goes e3, Magnus goes nc6, and Hikaru goes for nbd2. After bf5, Hikaru goes for c3. Magnus now develops his e6 pawn, and Hikaru goes for an arguably desperate move qb3 to try to have an early advantage, or maybe try to put some pressure on the b7 pawn. So, after Hikaru's qb3, Magnus goes for qd7, which lets him bring his queen out at a tempo. And now Hikaru needs to play for an idea instead of the best move, or else his queen will be attacked and he could very realistically lose the game. Moving on, Hikaru goes for bb5. Magnus takes the knight on d2. Normally, as per the rules and principles, the knight should take the knight back. But Hikaru decides to take the knight back with his king. If you showed this position to anyone, no one in their right mind would say anything other than a beginner played this. The position just looks hideous for white. But the genius behind this move is that Hikaru kind of forces Magnus's next move. Because now, if Magnus tries to push the bishop out, Hikaru can ignore it and play ne5, attacking the queen and knight. Then you'd have to go on the defensive by moving the queen. Magnus plays f6, not allowing any knight e5 ideas. So Hikaru went for qa4, applying pressure to the knight. So Magnus played rc8 to unpin himself. Hikaru broke his pawn chain by taking the c5 pawn. His idea was to put his knight on d4, after bishop takes the pawn back to put pressure on knight on c6 and on the bishop on f5. Magnus pushed the e-pawn first. Hikaru goes bg3. Magnus took the pawn back. Hikaru goes for rook h to d1 so he can move his king to the safe squares. a6 by Magnus and be2 by Hikaru. Magnus plays ne7, forcing the queen trade, qxqd7 and bxqd7. Hikaru plays ke1 and Magnus plays be6. So, after be6, h3, kf7, nd2, h5, rc1, Magnus decides to go for nf5 to attack the bishop. Magnus goes nd6 and eyes the e4 square. Hikaru prevents this by playing bf3. Pawn g5, ndb3, and Magnus jumps to the e4 square with his knight. Magnus's idea is to force Hikaru to trade pieces and get into an endgame where his bishop is basically in a straitjacket. In this position, a pawn is threatening a bishop. That bishop is threatening a knight, and two rooks are staring at each other. I swear these grandmasters are partly human, because no logical human being would end up in this position. Magnus takes the bishop, so Hikaru takes the bishop with check. Magnus takes the pawn on e7 with the king. G takes f3 by Hikaru and a rook trade by the players. Now Magnus plays ng5, leading both of them into a knight and bishop endgame. Hikaru goes for f4, blocking the escape squares for the knight, making sure that the knight is trapped. After the computer analysis at the depth of 18, the stockfish claims the pawn on f4 to be the most critical pawn, giving it a value of 6 points. Magnus went for e4, not letting the king come to the f3 square. Hikaru goes for kf1, rg8. Hikaru goes for rc5 so that he can play f5 pawn at some point and open the dark square bishop. Magnus instantly goes for f5, protecting the pawn on h5 as well. After re5, kf6, bg3, hoping to go bishop h4 at some point, Magnus goes for rg4. Hikaru goes for re8, and after h4, bishop h2. So technically, both Magnus's knight and Hikaru's bishop are trapped and can't do anything. Now, Magnus goes kg6, rh8, kg7, rb8, b5, rb7, kg6, and Hikaru goes for rook to b6, giving a check to the king. Hikaru completely misses the idea of the black king going to h5 and entering Hikaru's territory. So, Hikaru just went for taking the pawn on a6. Magnus goes rg7, rf6, kg4, kg2. And now Magnus decides to sacrifice the knight by playing f2. Hikaru takes the knight back with his king and kh3. bg1, rg2 plus, rook g2 check, kf1, rxb2, bf2, kg4, rg6, kf3, bxh4, rb1, bd1, blocking the check. Magnus takes the pawn. Hikaru goes for rb6, attacking the pawn. Hikaru is in a very bad position and is trying to repeat moves that can lead the game to a draw. Magnus plays kf3 and now rh6 followed by e3 by Magnus. rh3 check and ke4, rh5 and pawn to b4. rh2, Hikaru is now shuffling because he knows that his position is crumbling, and Magnus is going to slowly march his pawns towards the queening square. ra1 by Magnus and rb2 by Hikaru. kf3, rh2, and kxf4. rh4 check, kf3. rh3 check, and ke4. rh2 and Magnus pushes the f5 pawn, slowly but surely taking the breathing space of Hikaru's pieces. This is a very uncomfortable position for Hikaru, who plays rb2. kf3 by Magnus. Hikaru knows that he has to protect the a pawn at all costs. Now he goes rh3 check, ke4. Hikaru pins the pawn to the king by playing rh4. Magnus plays rb2, attacking the pawn. Hikaru plays bg3, but Magnus capitalizes the position and plays kf3. Hikaru retreats his bishop to e1 and Magnus takes the a1 pawn. Hikaru gives a check by playing rh3, kg5, and then he plays rh8. Magnus pushes the pawn to b3. Now the position is just lost for Hikaru. The best case scenario for him is to get a draw, which he could normally achieve, but normally he doesn't have 17 seconds on the clock against arguably the greatest player the world has ever seen. rb8 and b2 by Magnus. rb5 check by Hikaru and kg4 by Magnus. rb4, kf5, rb8, and f3 by Magnus. rb4 to cut off the king from the pawns. Magnus then pushes the f pawn to f2. bxf2 and pawn takes bishop. And in this position, Hikaru resigned because he's unable to capture the f pawn due to a discovered check if Magnus promotes the pawn to a queen. This was a crazy game before the game even started, as Magnus came almost 30 seconds late, which grew to a minute time disparity by the 6th move. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will get back to you for some more recaps soon.